Good afternoon and welcome to Examining a Vendor Data Center and Colocation Model, a three-part webinar series, and today we're featuring part 2, Colocation Provider Selection, Contracting, and Migration, Setting Yourself Up for Success. This is a webinar tweet chat combo from healthsystemcio.com, sponsored by Iron Mountain. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the editor-in-chief of healthsystemcio.com, and I will be your webinar moderator today. We are having a simultaneous tweet chat hosted by Kate Gamble, our managing editor and director of social media. You can participate in a separate browser or on your phone by using the hashtag HSCIOchat, or if you want to simply view the tweet chat, you can do so in the media viewer panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We're also going to be using the Q&A panel today. You're going to want to type in your questions as they occur to you and submit them. Leave the default set to all panelists, and we will take those later on in the program, but go ahead and type them in as they occur to you. And you can download the deck using the URL on your screen. It's at the bottom of our slides and also being sent out in the chat box. Just so you can see how we're going to spend our time today, we're going to go about 45 to 50 minutes today. First, we're going to have our featured panel discussion with Chuck Podesta, CIO at UC Irvine Health, Art Ream, Senior Director of IT Applications and CISO with the Cambridge Health Alliance, and Chris Bair, VP of Iron Mountain Data Centers. So without further delay, let's jump right in. Chuck, you want to give us an overview of your role and organization?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Anthony. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for taking the time out of your busy days. I'm the CIO of UC Irvine Health, and UC Irvine Health is part of the University of California health system. There's 5 medical centers, UC Davis, UC San Francisco, UCLA, and UC San Diego, and Irvine is part of that, and we all work very closely together. I've been at UC Irvine for 3.5 years, and we actually just went live with a big implementation on Epic using UC San Diego as our host on a big connect. So we're the first of 2 academic medical centers to be on the same instance of Epic in the United States. So that's been an interesting project. So looking forward to the conversation.
Very good, Art.
Yeah, my name is Art Ream. I'm the CISO and Senior Director of Applications at Cambridge Health Alliance. We're a 3-hospital system serving about 140,000 patients in the Cambridge, Somerville, Boston Metro North area. We're HIMSS level 6 and 7 in our certifications. Both ambulatory is level 7 and looking for HIMSS 6 for our inpatient this year. We are primarily a dual shop, actually. We're a Meditech and an Epic shop. Most all of our clinical operations is focused on the Epic platform. And this year, we're moving everything off of Meditech's revenue cycle platform over into Epic, so we're making a transitional change this year. And 2 years ago, we co-located our data center and consolidated all our efforts off-site, which is why we're talking about this stuff today. And that's kind of Cambridge as a whole.
Excellent. Thank you, Art. Chris?
Sure. I'm Chris Bair. I am responsible for the data center product inside of Iron Mountain's data center group. Iron Mountain, I think hopefully most people on the call are at least a little bit aware of us. We've been around since 1951. We've got 230,000 customers in 52 countries now. The data center group is it's a service we've provided for almost 30 years. After initially sort of doing what we would call a build-to-suit project, where we'd take someone like Chuck or Art and build on one of our properties a specific facility for them. 6 years ago, we stood up a standalone division where we'd create more traditional multi-tenant colocation space, and that's gone well. That business that I'm associated with is we've got about 2 million feet of data center space now.
Okay.
3 continents now. So.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Chris. Looking forward to our chat today. Chuck, we're gonna start with you. We got broken it up today into different segments. Our discussion. We're gonna start with the concept of selection. So sure. Let's say you've made the decision in an abstract sense that co-location is the right move for your organization. What's the next step in going forward?
Well, we actually went through that process here, and we did it as part of the UC Health. 5 CIOs got together on this and decided, by the way, we had 13 data centers amongst the 5 organizations that we owned, and everything was basically on-premise when we started this a couple of years ago. And so what we did was, the first step was really to look at the strategic plan, business plan, and look at the costs associated and the risks associated with having our own data centers and keeping them up to standards and the like. So as part of that process, we went through and started to look at, if we collapse these 13 into 2 data centers and co-located, away from our campuses, what would that look like? What would the cost be? What would the savings be associated with that? And then brought that through our respective IT governance processes and combined efforts on that. So that's my recommendation, is really to take a look at your current footprint and whether you own the data centers and the costs associated with doing that, and the costs going forward as well. Here in California, we've got issues, with earthquakes, and the building codes are getting stricter and stricter. So we at UC Irvine, we're actually in a building right now that if we had a data center, if we had an earthquake, they would basically tag the building and nobody would be allowed in there, and basically would not have a data center. So we had some urgency to keep that moving. But again, up to your IT governance to get approval before you even contact vendors, unless you need some background information on some potential costs, and you may want to engage a few of them, but not in a formal way yet.
Chuck, was there any thought to going to 3 data centers, or was it always 2?
It was 2 because what we tried to do was go to data centers that had disaster recovery already baked in. That was basically part of our RFP process. And we also had to look at things geographically because of use of Davis and San Francisco being north. We actually settled on their primary data centers in Quincy, Washington, and for UCLA, UC San Diego, and UC Irvine, we picked a place in Irvine. So our primary is Irvine, with our backup in Quincy, Washington. The northern UC organizations are primary in Washington and backup in Irvine, and each one of these have other facilities that they back up to as well. So hopefully you can work that into your RFP. Otherwise, you would have to, from a disaster recovery, create your own, either on-site or, again, another co-location.
Okay, very good. Art, let's go with you on this one. Can a decision, and Chuck touched on this, can the decision to co-locate in principle be made without having a specific vendor in mind? Is this a one-step process or a two-step process?
Well, I think it can be made independently without a vendor in mind. I mean, we all sit here and looked, and our process was to sit back, look at our current infrastructure that we have to maintain, where it's located in our physical on-prem site, which we went through all of that, and then started to look at the the different data center options available in the Boston metro area and the outlying community. So I mean, and then it started into, okay, now let's look at the facilities and evaluate those. And we also went down through the fact that okay, so going a half a mile in Boston could be like going on a 3-hour trip at times. So you have to think about, when I have to send a technician, frankly, out to, the data center, we had to be, you had to think through those things. And some emergencies come up that you got to go to the data center even though you have people on site. Like I said, the co-location matters in depending on the area that you're at.
Okay, so, but it can be a two-step process. You can decide in principle and then, okay, let's go find a vendor.
Yep.
Okay, very good. Chuck, back to you on this one. What would selecting a vendor co-location partner look like? Would it be different than a traditional RFP process? What are some criteria to keep in mind? And you may want to, when you answer this, you may want to keep in mind folks also who are not in the situation that you were in, but maybe looking for a vendor as opposed to consolidating within their health system. Just your best advice on that.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, the growth aspect is really important. We actually did a traditional RFP because we wanted to keep the vendors honest going forward with that process, and be able to look at apples to apples comparisons of what we're looking for. But some of the biggest criteria is really around future growth and what that looks like. You really got to map that out for yourself, because that's going to drive the contract and the costs associated with moving forward, because these are multi-year agreements. So you really need to look out and look at that growth strategy. It also has an impact on your network and how you size that and how that grows over time. So that was the biggest thing for us at this point, was that growth, really making sure we understood that, so there weren't any unexpected expenses, costs along the way in year 2 or year 3 that then get you in trouble with your CFOs at this point. So that was the biggest thing for us. The other thing we were looking for too was who else was co-located in the building. If there were Fortune 500 companies or Fortune 50 companies, that was a plus for us, because we knew that the facility must be hardened, bulletproof. Otherwise, those organizations would not have chosen them as a partner. That's something to think about as well, as who are your neighbors, and are they outside the healthcare industry, which is not a bad thing if they're a high-profile type of client.
Those are 2 great pieces of advice. So number 1 is you have to project your future growth and then discuss that, or that's got to be involved with your discussion with the vendors, so you have an understanding of how your costs are going to rise. And also find out who else is in the data center, essentially getting references. Did you actually reach out to get any contacts from any of those co-located tenants who would be next door to you, so to speak, and reach out to any of them? I mean, or do you recommend that? Go ahead.
Yeah, we absolutely did, because we had references. As part of the RFP process, we wanted references from clients. So the best reference was the people that were already in there. So we contacted them, those companies directly. Absolutely.
Excellent. Chris, I want to go to you next. First, I want to give you, before I ask this question, I want to give you an opportunity to comment on the 2 points that Chuck just made about future growth impacting costs of the contract, and also references of who else is in the data center.
Yeah, they're both good things to look at, right? I think, and I like how Chuck put it. Sometimes organizations, what comes over is so specific that someone wants, I think, almost like the exact replica of themselves. Do you have any left-handed people in healthcare on the line? Right, and it's so narrow that no, right?
Right.
But I like how he looks at it. It's sort of like similarly situated, right? Equivalently high standards from availability, folks that are also highly regulated, et cetera. Because to a degree, having a big Fortune 50 customer, the rigor that you go through would be equivalent to what you would put in for a healthcare system, right? And the compliance framework might be different, right? We might have PCI and things like that versus HIPAA, but the rigor is the same. And so I think that's a nice way to look at it. When there's not someone perfect, just think about who else has got super high standards. I think I like that quite a lot, and I think references are particularly important. And a lot of times, one would hope that most decent operators of a facility have got reasonable availability. The lights stay on, things like that. It's sort of expected at this point as what we do has matured. I think a lot of what's good about the references is you can get things, even if it's just tips around, hey, how did they do helping you during migration, or how did your first equipment refresh go there, and things like that aren't necessarily going to be captured in the agreement, right, but are just things for you to wrap your head around and think about for sort of the project phase, if that makes any sense. So I think references can be helpful across a variety of areas for customers that get them.
Here's a curveball for you, Chris, or
Sure.
question. What would be your advice on someone who wanted to check a reference. So let's say I'm Chuck and I'm looking at Iron Mountain and you send me a list of references. Well, I assume those people are happy. You're not going to send them to me, but is there a way when you contact them to ask certain things to get some real information? You know what I mean? References always have that thing about them. You know, I'm not going to give you people that are not happy. So how do you get around that?
That's interesting. I mean, you could. One of the things you could do, I guess, and I don't want to encourage this, but kidding. But I think you could say it's great. I think you could also dig in. It's kind of like I just said. I mean, one of the things is I think when people start out and they're going to be generally positive if someone's given you to them. That's at least what you would expect. I think you can use LinkedIn to find other people in the org, right? That you are probably friends of, if not in your network. You know, to go to someone's same org, they can also give you kind of their version of it. I also think if you just go, hey, I assume that they've done okay because you're a reference, but what are the little things or the things that change? You know, I think that's probably a good thing, right? Is again, you'd be hopeful that they're not going to go, no, it's terrible, and we've been down 9 days in a row, right? It's not going to be great. But I do think if you hint around and just kind of converse, people will share the things that they would like to have seen done better, or that they would have maybe even changed in their own approach to it. So. Yeah,
and I think you're absolutely right. It's the third and fourth question where you get the honesty, and hopefully it's positive stuff. All right, let's go with the question on the screen here. Did you, would you, should you include meetings with the vendor service teams to get a feel for how things would work post-implementation if you select them? Chris, your thoughts on that?
I think you should, and it's funny. Again, I've been in this industry since I got out of the military in the late 90s, and I started out in operations before I kind of came into this sort of a role. And I always thought it was important for customers, and the good ones would typically say, hey, can we meet the folks that actually run the facility? And probably of even higher importance, can we meet the team, or can we meet the person or the project manager that you'd assign to us if we put this forward? And I think that's a pretty important thing. I think just like with any project, right, the initial phase, implementation, cut over, that's probably one of the periods of kind of highest stress with the relationship and the rest. And I think that person and their ability to kind of talk about what they've done historically to support an organization like yours, or even how they ask you questions and how they engage with you, to get a feeling for, is this person, going to be a pretty consultative resource for us, or are they kind of like, do what I say? I think you can get a pretty good feel for it. So I always strongly encourage it. Again, particularly, however, groups, we all handle the implementation differently, but I always encourage people to get a feel for the people that they would use during what's probably the toughest time in the relationship.
Very good. Art, I'd like you to weigh in on this question, and you could talk a little bit about your experience. Is this a request you've made? Has it been accommodated? And what might a CIO think if a vendor is reluctant to provide such contact or level of detail?
Yeah, we when we went through our engagements, particularly, the vendor was very graciously accepting of our request to actually meet with the team, down with the team that are going to actually support, not only the infrastructure at the facility as well, and the people that are boots on the ground, as I like to call them, unlocking the doors and providing the security and everything, and how we were going to migrate around the facility should we need to in the middle of the night and stuff like that, running your AC, your power and everything. We really had a nice engagement with them, and it was free coming. They would tell us that, they even presented issues where we had this incident and that incident, and this is how we remediated them. And we heard, they would voluntarily gave us that reference. So, I mean, when we were doing our due diligence, we actually talked to the people that had that incident, and they said, yep, we didn't like what they did here, yep, we liked what they did there, but it was an honest across-the-board engagement. So I think that's very important from your service vendor and choosing, you know, the facility that you have, as well as getting an experience and a feel for the facility. You know, one of the other things that was a little painful at the first part was the contact at the facility, because they always got to give you a 24/7, 365 contact and a call center to come in. That was a little rocky at the beginning, but it actually turned itself around, and we didn't see any of that in the due diligence because the cohort of people that we talked to for references that were given, as well as, you know, as you say, gotten off of LinkedIn and stuff like that, hadn't had a need to do that, but we were in just a case that we actually had to make calls off hours, and so that process got refined. So, you know, there was an honest engagement back and forth, which, you know, puts you at ease and actually helps the interaction.
Very good. Thank you, Art. Chuck, let's go to you on this one. How much of a role should specific business challenges like disaster recovery play in the selection of a co-location partner?
I think it's extremely important because you need to know from a DR perspective what you're getting with that co-location and whether you've got to do something. We mentioned it earlier, whether you've got to do something on your own. You know, by sending the team to each of the vendors, which we just talked about, that was part of their goal, was to not only talk to the service team there and get comfortable with them, but also to look at what the DR aspects of the co-location was as well. And again, going back to, you know, if you have a Fortune 50 in there, you're pretty sure that there's some DR associated with that co-location vendor. Otherwise, they wouldn't have signed. So that gives you a little bit of comfort, but you've really got to look at that. Otherwise, you know, from a budgeting standpoint and cost, you've got to figure out your own DR strategy, maybe with another co-location vendor or even on your own with some on-premise types of facilities, which again add to the cost. So that needs to be, in my mind, you know, completely wrapped in with that selection process, and we actually had it. You know, they needed to describe what that was as part of the RFP process. We did have, because we had the northern strategy and the southern strategy, we were able to work it in that, you know, the north would back up the south and vice versa, depending on who was primary and who was secondary. So we did work some of that in, and it was two different vendors, so we had to bring them together. And even though they had their own kind of DR, we wanted to make sure that they were going to work well together, knowing that, you know, 5 organizations were going to be using both those facilities.
Very good. Chuck, a question on references. Is it possible to put too much emphasis on references and then not do the due diligence you're supposed to? Is that even conceivable? Can you imagine someone doing that?
Yeah, no, I can, because, you know, it's easy to say, you know, when you mentioned about Fortune 50 or Fortune 500, say, oh, they've got you know, 2 of those companies in there, they must be, you know, top notch. Let's forego that part and just kind of move forward, because if they're in there, everything's, you know, must be fine. But, you know, that doesn't mean they're in there. They may be leaving there because they're not happy. You don't know where they are in their process, and how many years they've been in there. Maybe they've only been in there for 6 months. Things like that. So you've got to send your teams out there. And the teams need to be comfortable with the service teams, and because you've got these technical people who are working with technical people, and, you know, they want to be able to be on a first name basis at some point. And so the only way to do that is to send your teams to those facilities and work with those vendors and see which service team that they feel is the most competent and you know, that they know they can collaborate with and work with. Because again, you're talking about, you know, multiple years here.
Right. So you do your homework, you do all your work, and then those references can make you feel sort of a little more comfortable, but not an excuse not to do the groundwork. Right.
Exactly.
Got it. Art, let's start with you on this one. Now we're into the next sort of segment here, which is about doing the actual contracting. Obviously very important. I'm going to give each of you a chance to weigh in on this important question. What's your best advice on co-location contracting? What are some of the things that you do not want to leave out of the contract?
Yeah, so when we, you know, obviously you don't want to leave out your in-house counsel and legal team, so don't forget to bring them to the table. It's not necessarily all about the technology and the cool lights and the cooling systems and all that fun stuff. But from the delivery service, you know, trying to collocate their data center, you want to make sure that legal's at the table and you go through each one of the, you know, the prescribed clauses. You know, what is the expectation of the uptime of the utility services in the building, and, you know, what are the expectations? I mean, we got down into, do you have dual feeds for power? Do you have, you know, all of that? You know, what's the backup processes that you have in place, and the policies and the procedures? And we went down through all of that with legal. And then, you know, what are the deliverables, and who's responsible for what part of the data center, and who's responsible for, you know, racking systems, who can be allowed in there. We got pretty detailed in that. So they were long discussions, and you don't want to leave out, you know, the expectations of, you know, what you want from a 24/7, 365 data center. And most of them, I have to say, I mean, they've been in the game long enough, they understand this. So 90% of that is all standard language. One of the things that we had to do, I mean, some people have different needs. So one of our needs was we were in there more often than not, meaning physically, due to only our constraints as far as some of our systems that we deployed, versus doing everything from a virtual process, even though we had complete access to that. So those are one of the things they were like, well, you need to get in here at 3 o'clock in the morning on a regular basis. You know, there's emergency processes. Anyways, long story short is that you have to look at your business operations, your IT infrastructure, and what you have to manage from your systems that you're going to set up there, and, you know, your access and everything that's planned around that. And those were some of the things that, you know, we went at. I mean, the banks and stuff like that that are co-located where we are, they didn't need to get in there. We did, for obvious reasons, for some of our systems. And that was one of the sticking points in the process.
Quick follow-up, Art. Could you conceive a scenario where a smaller hospital maybe that's interested in doing this would not have the in-house legal advice necessary to pursue this properly, and might need to bring in someone with specialized expertise?
Yeah, I mean, we had in-house counsel. Obviously, you know, not everybody has that that's, you know, fluent in this, and usually your in-house counsels, or if you're a smaller hospital that doesn't have counsel, has a contracted counsel. You got to consider the costs that are going to be incurred by that, whether you have a flat rate fee for the year no matter what legal work you do, or, you know, your in-house can call in their expertise to go through the process with you. But there is a consideration there and an expense that's, you know, played against the bottom line in the budget.
Right, it's got to be taken into account. Chris, I'd like your thoughts on the best advice on contracting. Obviously, you're coming at it from the other side, but what do you think is sort of reasonable and fair?
You know, it's interesting. As I was thinking about earlier conversations between Art and Chuck, a lot of what they described, this is kind of pre-contracting, is a lot of conversation with you and the provider. And you know, when we have new people on board and we talk about what we do and our culture and the rest, I say, hey, it's a marriage when somebody comes in, right? And so the better you know your partner, it seems a little bit, you have a better relationship, right? So I was just I wanted to take a step back and go, I really like how they thought and how they got, and the vendors, I'm not a vendor to either of these gentlemen, so this isn't me trumpeting myself, but I like how their vendors were pretty transparent, pretty open with them, and talked about the good and the bad, and they got into not just what do you do on a perfect day, but what do you do when things go bad and those sorts of things. And a lot of that speaks to culture as well, because there are good organizations that wouldn't be a good customer of mine because the service that they want or something isn't what we do, and that goes for everybody, right? You just it's not just building contract, it's kind of expectation, people, culture, all these things, because you get pretty tightly interwoven, and it is a first-name basis. And the teams, a good provider should be an extension of your team versus kind of a barrier, if that makes any sense. And I just liked how they described it. I thought it was good. As you think about contracting, Chuck mentioned it, I think growth is hard for people to manage, right? Because you got your historic growth, and then you got growth as you're thinking about doing more things, and maybe less in healthcare, but certainly other industries. The cloud's particularly disruptive, and sometimes growth, what has historically been growth, right, isn't the historic growth anymore. So folks, they get real challenged with that. And so one of the things that we'll typically see when folks are coming out and doing it the first time is they're thinking super long-term and a super long-term growth curve, and they're trying to figure it out and driving themselves crazy. And one of the things we often encourage is to say, within reason, if you can match an equipment refresh cycle up against your contract, that certainly simplifies things, because in the next 3 to 5 years, whatever your cycle is, it's less likely that you're going to have massive change one way or the other. You know, you're going to kind of, whatever your growth has been, it probably will be in that period of time. So that's important. Other things I tell people, there's always, and we'll probably talk about it later too, but if you do for some reason have a degradation of service, and whether it's the physical facility or whether it's kind of the responsiveness of the people, one of the things that nobody puts in a baseline agreement, but you can negotiate, is a termination for cause, right? And it would be kind of on, if you had a series of service level agreement failures in a given period of time, that you would effectively be able to leave. And that's a pretty nuclear option, right? It's expensive. Switching costs are very high. It's not anything that anybody as a provider would take lightly. But it's also one where getting a couple $100 credit isn't worth, right, periodic failures in a facility. And so it's a nice hammer to have in there for you should things just, you know, you get new ownership, something happens and it goes bad. So that's an important one. I think other than that, kind of like we talked about, access to space, shipping, receiving, all these things that aren't what you necessarily focus on at first, which is my space, my environment, my network. I think a lot of times working in the common areas, the things that we use for other customers, is something that you want to understand, and if you need to kind of codify your access to those spaces. Because again, you tend to kind of think about your environment and not what comes with working in common environments, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think
go ahead, Art. Go ahead, Art.
I think to much to Chris and Chuck's point, I mean, just really one other extra point about the contract and the engagement that, you know, I think you have with the vendor. I always go into it with a real caution if it seems too good. And what I mean by that is, you know, everything that they've done from a co-location, was designed, built, and validated by a human. And God knows that we are intently, you know, prone to being failure at some point in time in any given process. So if there's not transparency that says, okay, we did fail in this, I mean, I expect that. I would hope that they would say that, because I know that, you know, if I was designing it, I would probably mess up something. And I think we all have to be honest with each other. We do it every day, only because of the human nature and the complexity of things. So when they do that transparency and they come forth and say, look, you know, we messed this up, this is not quite right, we've corrected that, I mean, that's a true indication of their engagement to the client, in my opinion.
And it's and also just to add a couple of things that we worked in that were real important is we worked in something called right of first refusal on contiguous data center space, because you can, you know, it's easier to add based on volume contiguously than to be across the room, or because you actually have fiber costs associated with connecting cages and things like that. So you can save a lot of money by when there's continuous space available to use that space. Also to, you know, the volume discounts as you grow, there's ways to do that as well. If you can figure out what your growth is, maybe work in some volume discounts as you grow over the second, third, fourth, and fifth years of the contract. I think that's really important. And you know, and a part of the negotiation, never take the first offer. That's kind of contracting 101, but never do that.
All right, very good, very good. All right, let's go to our next question. Chuck, let's stick with you. What internal and external resources should a CIO work with during the contracting process? Of course, Art touched on legal. Any other individuals, entities, both either inside or outside, that the CIO is going to want to leverage?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, of course, your CTO, your CISO, you know, you've talked about contracting legal. You really need to build a team, and that would be on the internal side. On the external side, I think you really need to have a relocation specialist, because most of the co-location organizations, they have, you know, strong service teams within the co-location itself, but they're not migration specialists, and they're not skilled in that. They're waiting for you to figure out how to get the equipment there, and then, or stand up the equipment, and if you're going to be relocating some stuff, they're probably not going to be part of that contract. So you want to have somebody who's a relocation specialist on the outside. And there's many companies that just do that, and also they'll put feet on the ground when it comes to the weekend or whenever that you're making the cutover as well. So you want to make sure that that could be a separate RFP, or it could be a company that the colocation organization works with. There's a variety of ways to find that out, but without that, I think that's you're looking at a really tough time if you're just relying on your internal organization expertise under the CTO and under the CISO to make the relocation happen.
Excellent, very good. All right, Chris, let's go with you on this. What contract duration makes sense, and how long do you think it should be?
I think in most cases, right, I think matching, kind of like I mentioned there, I think matching your equipment refresh cycle is what I would do if I were in your seat. Now, again, there are things I don't understand about our various customer organizations, but that's what I would do. And when I say with exception, that's only for really kind of particularly large sort of, we're a real big system, and we're taking down a 10,000-foot kind of multi-megawatt data hall. That might be something that you think more like you would leasing any other property, and you're going to do a 10-year lease with 5-year renewal options, more like a real estate transaction, even though it's data center. But if I were, doing more, things like we've talked about today, that's kind of how I would handle it, particularly because of kind of the challenges and the changes in IT right now. And just like Chuck mentioned, there are lots of ways to, even inside of that time frame, to some with a cost, some without a cost, like expansion options, manage costs within that time frame. So again, you're not forced to overbuy, to hold down lots and lots of stuff in case of, right? You're able to go, this is pretty realistic and this is a pretty normal number. You can also ask the vendor to say, hey, if power is the limiting factor for my space, which is pretty typical, because you'll normally say you can use a couple hundred kilowatts of IT load in total in this space, then how much do your typical customers draw as a percentage of their limit? And that's a way for you to think about, how much do I need for cushion, right, relative to kind of my normal growth, relative to where we might get eventually. So that seems to be more of a trend right now, and it's something that we're happy to help support.
Art, what do you think about that? Art? Did you go on mute, Art?
Yeah, the thing you told us not to do earlier. See, that was my attempt to demonstrate that we're human. That was my attempt to tell you that we're human and we can design bad processes. That was my admission to that. There you go.
Love it. Well demonstrated.
See, I'm paying attention here. We had started originally with a 5-year, and then, like you said, the hardware refresh process and that generally was a lot more accelerated. And what really scares me is that these days that process keeps getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and the reason it keeps getting shorter and shorter is the technology keeps refreshing and changing at a breakneck speed. Especially with your servers, your virtuals, your VMs, and stuff like that. So when you start to think about those contracts, you could be on a totally different platform or a totally different infrastructure inside of 3 years. And we're creeping up on a 2-year thing. So you really need to think about that in the space that you're going to need and you're going to use, because it starts to shrink. It starts to get really small these days. I mean, I can remember the data center that we had here. And the one that I had at a former employee was enormous. And stuff like that now is going down to these smaller footprints, and it just keeps getting quicker and a pace quicker. So I think you need to take all of that into consideration when you run through these contractual obligations.
Chuck, any thoughts, sir?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you need to, to me, it's like a 3 to 5 year based on that refresh cycle. But the other thing you've got to look at is actually our co-location strategy is a step to our cloud strategy. And so you're constantly going to be pushing as much of your applications, whether you're changing them or your application vendors are developing new ways to host those particular applications, that you're going to be pushing as much of that to the cloud, whether it's private or public, over that period of time as well. So you've got to take that into account. You want to be locked into a growth strategy that actually becomes a strategy where you're paying money for space that you're actually not using because you aggressively move to the cloud. So I know we haven't talked about that, kind of a whole different subject, but you really need to think about that, and especially over a 5-year type of contract.
The cloud is absolutely a catalyst for all of our customers for coming to us, right? And we also know, because we see, just like both Chuck and Art have said, we also expect that customers will shrink when they renew, whether it's 2 years, 3 years, whatever, that because more goes to the cloud. One of these kind of contract-related questions, or RFPs even, is 10 years ago, every provider would say, who are your network providers that are on net, right? Because that simplifies things in cost and timing, and it's a good question to still ask. But I think 5 or 6 years ago, the preponderance of our RFPs and every tour, people want to know what cloud service providers are available and kind of how do you access them, and what's the level of difficulty there, and is it one of those ones where it's kind of a permanent thing, or can they turn up and turn down services? Because everyone's facing the challenge, and everyone is looking for, because they're making this move, part of what they have to contemplate is this a place where we can execute kind of a hybrid cloud strategy, right? Which is typically you've got something co-located that you own, and then some kind of workload that you're putting in the cloud. And so I think it's a huge consideration. So I think it's a good one to think about with term too.
Excellent. Very good. All right, Chuck, let's go with you on this one. One of the things executives fear most about getting into outsourcing or co-location agreements is they'll never be able to get out if things go bad, or maybe if they just change their strategy. How can that fear be addressed in the contract?
Yeah, so that's just super important. Chris touched on this, is, solid, very well-defined SLAs are needed, and very as detailed as you can possibly get them, with fairly substantial credits, depending on non-compliance to those SLAs over a period of time. If you're off by 1 month, that's one thing, but if you go 4, 5, 6 months and the SLAs are not being met, there should be something substantial there. And then also that termination, early termination, if SLAs are not met over a long period of time. I think as part of that, I think forced face-to-face meetings on a regular basis, whether that's every quarter, something along those lines, where a team is reviewing those SLAs, so it's not just a report that's being sent back and forth. And it's part of establishing that relationship, since you're going to be partners for a while, hopefully. And I think that will help alleviate some of the concerns. One of the benefits, though, that I think is important for your senior leaders to understand is that you're actually transferring the risk to another organization. When you think about security, assuming that's very strong and it needs to be part of your contract within that vendor, you're transferring a lot of that physical security risk, because now they're responsible for everything being locked and access and everything that goes on there, not you. And that's big. There could still be a breach, and there could still be a problem, but that vendor now is financially responsible for whatever might occur, fines, things like that. They're tethered to you in that way. So I think that's important for senior leaders to understand, that there is a benefit, not that goes beyond cost as well. But again, the stronger you can get those SLAs, the better you're going to be.
Very good. Art, your thoughts?
Yeah, we one of the things that we considered was, and I didn't hear this pop up, but we also asked another question, obviously with the SLAs and that process. We also asked if the parent company, if there was one, whether they were an offshore company incorporated. So in other words, you'd be subject to different, depending on how the legal process fell out with any given breach or security vulnerability, you fall under different regulations, and depending on the parent company or of the data center, you could be subject to, more stringent or less stringent, operations and contractual items. So that was one of the things that we look at very closely, obviously with PHI, PI, and all of those kind of things, and where we're going to host from the healthcare industries. We asked about those processes as well as obviously the standard SLAs and what the out clauses were, and what if, like Chuck mentioned and Chris both, that if you didn't deliver on certain metrics, what was the options that we had, and negotiated those in the contracts.
Chris, so let's talk about contracts from the vendor point of view. Obviously, we're talking about protections for the hospital if they want to get out. Are there certain things in there that protect, the vendor? I mean, the biggest thing is payment, right? I mean, you got to pay your bill. Otherwise, we're not going to keep your data here. But your thoughts on just, obviously the hospitals want to feel that they could get out when they need to, and that transition would be smooth. But then I'm sure on the vendor side, there's some things that are reasonable for you to ask for, that are not unreasonable and not like you're trying to hold them hostage.
Yeah, no, for sure. And there is, it's a shared risk to a degree, right? Because you've got other folks in the facility with you, and then we put, $100 million into the facility. So there's things like each party needs to have certain levels of insurance, right? So we don't, let bad things happen without kind of an ability to repair what happens there. With us, because Iron Mountain deals with classically conservative companies like in healthcare and public sector, so all of our staff, vendors, et cetera, go through a background investigation process, and we ask any customer who wants to have team members who have unescorted access in there, i.e. they can come in anytime, right? They kind of have admin rights to your space, right? Your employees or your vendors, that you either have an equivalent background investigation process or they go through ours, right? Things like that, just to ensure, again, that everyone in there is kind of minimally vetted, because there are other people within the campus, right? So we'd like to understand as best we can ahead of time if there's any risk there. So there are certainly things we do. And sort of a little bit on that note, on that last question, when we were talking about a termination for repeated, failures, one of the things I always encourage people also is specify what that process would be, right? So if somebody goes, fine, this is the third time, and now we've triggered, you're out. And if your option is you have to be out in 30 days, it's not going to be doable for most organizations, right? So I would also kind of talk about interval acknowledgement, and then what is the period of time you would then have to extricate yourself out of there, because it's not enough that you have the right if you can't kind of contractually pull it off. Same thing for us. It's why, like at renewal, we tell people, let's give each other 6 months before the end of the agreement, where I'll tell you if I'm changing your pricing, your terms, and you tell me if you need to change it, because it's good for both of us to get the planning in, right? And so, lots of reciprocity between us also de-risks kind of both parties, I think, environment.
Excellent. Very good. Chris, let's stay with you. If you manage a system with multiple facilities, is it possible to structure a volume-based contract that provides additional savings as more facilities transition to the co-location site?
You bet, for sure. And just inherently, right, the data center consolidation, right, there are federal initiatives around it. I think the cost savings is highly significant, right? And Chuck gave a good example very early in the discussion today about moving from lots of facilities to 2, and I'm sure he's got some really good savings metrics around that. And then with the provider, as expected, there should be a volume discount. You should be able to, oftentimes, what we'll say, you'll be able to ramp up, right? So if you have a certainty that we're going to go from X level to Y level to Z level over the first 12, 18 months, whatever your migration plan is, you can oftentimes match your outlay financially to those tiers. And then other things you can do as you're thinking about it is you can also define what like an unforeseen expansion would cost. Because once I've got you in there, you're pretty sticky. And so smart providers will say, if I need to expand and I don't know about it yet, what's my cost then, right? And so there's lots of ways to sort of either, get like or better, have costs controlled, minimize outflow, typically, again, if you're doing a big complex project like Chuck sounded like, you can also get a fairly long period in the beginning of an agreement where you're not getting hit for rent at all that allows you to kind of set up and stage and have a better interval on your project for cutover without, again, paying multiple vendors at the same time.
Very good. All right, I'm going to push us a few more minutes here because I just got a few more things I want to get to. Chuck, question from the audience. And you could say, we're going to say the question is, when you talk to a Fortune 50 or 500 companies, did you find a type of company such as banking, manufacturing, et cetera, more helpful in their insight and similarity to healthcare issues? So I don't know if you actually did have those calls, but either answer based on your experience or who you think might have a greater similarity to healthcare.
Yeah, so we did, and banking definitely. You know, they've been under a government scrutiny for a lot longer than healthcare has been with HIPAA. You know, and their restrictions and their security is very tight compared to manufacturing. So they were big, but also any of the firms, investment firms. You know, if you get a Goldman Sachs or something like that, again, they're under, you know, strict guidelines. Their uptimes are like incredible. I mean, that they're looking for because they're traded on the, and anybody that's traded on the stock exchange for that matter. But those investment companies are under government scrutiny as well as banking, and some of them overlap. So any of those industries to us were really, really important because of we just know that from a security perspective, that's really, really important to them.
All right, very good. We're going to go to our Ask a Co-Panelist feature, and then we're going to get going today. So, Chuck, I'm going to let you go first. Feel free to ask one or both of your co-panelists a question.
Sure, and let's go out to both of them. But, you know, as CIOs, we're always talking about getting out of the data center business. And, you know, co-location is a part of that, but you're still managing that, you know. And so what's your guys' thoughts on, you know, the next step before you get to the cloud even? We're starting to talk about maybe managed services and then actually not owning the asset and getting away from refreshes and things like that, and maybe doing longer contracts, you know, based on not owning the asset, not worrying about the management of the asset and the refreshes associated with it. And there seems to be some savings associated with that, especially on the capital side. Just want your thoughts on where you think that might be going.
Art, you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. So I think I'd be a big proponent of that from two ways of not managing the asset and thinking about it in this way. If you divorce yourself from owning the asset and the oversight of all of that, you actually save money as far as your staffing levels as well as your infrastructure. But I think there's a key component for the core data center operating processes and the hardware and everything that goes along with that, and particularly for a smaller health system such as myself, as well as the security thing. I'm a big proponent of having these SOCs and NOCs and all the healthcare industries supporting one local global center that we can actually contribute to, and it's watched 24/7. And therefore, what that affords in both cases, in both scenarios, both security and managed data center, that affords a pooled resource that gives you the latest, greatest, and best technology 24/7, 365. When something comes out, somebody's always looking for that, and you leverage a larger cohort of facilities and organizations. And from a security standpoint, I'd love to see that in the Boston area from that perspective. And the reason I say that is particularly we all have the same concerns. We're all under a highly regulated industry, and if we pool our resources from a security and infrastructure standpoint and we do the best of breed technology and we all contribute to that, you not only have cross-system watching of things that might go wrong, you've also got this overall best technology. As something changes, the pooled resources there, you can just buy it, put it in, and say, look what we've done. This is where we think we're going to go. You could do the same thing on the managed services and everything from a data center, and it would ultimately, do each system You know, I mean, you'd have to probably standardize, which would be somewhat of a pain point, but when you think about it, there's a lot of benefits to that.
Chris, for the sake of time, I'm going to give you the last word as your response to Chuck's question.
I think we see a little bit of both for sure. You know, and it's interesting. I talked to our own CTO. She's our IT lead overall, and I said, so we have a cloud offering for our customers here, and I said, we're cloud first. When do you stop using the data center, you know, for the corporation? And her take is, she goes, absolutely, we're cloud first, and she goes, but we'll always have a need, right? And whether it's an operating expense or a capital expense, and however we think about that, but she's always, there are some systems, right, that either can't or won't make sense to kind of put out there on the cloud, public or private. But I do think kind of the trend towards, however you think about it, more flexible solutions, shorter kind of time periods that you're committed, right? Smarter use of capital, right? And kind of an understanding that it's a time of change, and to be agile contractually and things like that, as Art and Chuck both described really well today, is certainly the biggest trend that we see.
Very good, very good. All right, well, that's about all we had time for today. I want to thank everyone for attending. When you close out your window, you'll be taken to a post-event survey. If you could take a moment and answer that, that would be great. Regarding continuing education, attending our events gets you 1 CEU towards the CHIME CHCIO certification program, so please let CHIME know you were here, and if you've asked us to do so, we will. If you need a certificate of attendance for another CEU program, you can use the final slide in this deck. And you will receive an email when our archive recording of this event has been posted to our YouTube channel. If you'd like us to produce a webinar on the topic of your choice, you can contact Nancy Wilcox from our team, and you can go ahead and go to our website to view our upcoming schedule of events. So with that, I want to thank our panel, Chuck Podesta, Art Ream, and Chris Bair. I want to thank our sponsor, Iron Mountain, very much for sponsoring this series. This has been part 2. You can go to our website to sign up for part 3. And I want to thank you, our attendees, for always coming to our events. With that, everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you.